psychologist, but now it is moving to psychiatry. And in between, I will intersperse a few things from the SAR, which has so much to do with what Scott's going to tell you. So hopefully I've got them settled down and quiet enough now. They didn't really have to listen to anything I said, but now the important stuff is coming. So here we go.
All right.
Take it away, Scott.
So I thought it'd be best, instead of just to start talking, to dive into the part of this that captured me first. And this is what I learned about the relationship between anxiety and boredom, okay? And so this is going to involve a diagram. Now, let's say that you've got a task you have to do, something like your job, something you need to get done. And let's say up here is the challenge level. So it's harder tasks live up at the top, very simple, easy stuff here at the bottom, okay? And let's say that you've got a particular skill set, as Liam Neeson would say, a particular set of skills that might or might not match that challenge level of what you're trying to do, all right? So think about the interrelationship of those two things. If something is incredibly challenging and you're just a beginner, your skill set is low, how do you feel facing that task? Enthusiastic and anxious, okay? So this is where anxiety is. Then this is, you know, for those who've gone through any type of difficult training program, this is how you feel at the beginning. This was my whole intern year in residency. I lived up there. Everything was challenging and my skills weren't good, okay? What if your skills are very high in this particular task, but the challenge is low?
Bored.
That's boredom, right? All right, so it turns out there is a sweet spot, and it's going to be along the center, right here. So if your skill set matches up with the level of challenge, and we call this flow. Flow is a state that most, if not everyone, has experienced at some point. If you are a musician or a singer and you've ever been lost in what you're doing, lost in your singing, if you've painted a picture and you've gotten lost in the work that you're doing and time stands still and you can't tell how long you've been at it, and at the end you just feel better, okay? That was a flow experience. Flow is when you're doing something that has the appropriate challenge level to match your skill set, and you've been able to lose yourself in it. And some people describe that, like Maslow, as a peak experience, okay? So this tells us a little bit about what we can do when we're feeling either bored or anxious, all right? So let's go there. So let's say we're bored. Anybody ever been bored?
Yeah,
I think several in the front row get bored pretty regularly.
For a long time.
I think you mean not counting that.
Correct.
Oh.
I can induce some boredom now. So, say you want to get from boredom to a flow experience so that you're actually gaining from what you're doing. It feels good and then you're gaining something from it. How do you do that?
Trying up the challenge.
You have to up the challenge. We are not wired to do that, right? As human beings, our instinct is to say, why would I make this harder on myself? Why do I want more challenge? But yet that actually turns out to be the solution. So if you're finding yourself getting bored, you have to make what you're doing harder in some way. And we'll talk about specific ways of doing that as we go on through the talk. What if you're like I was, an intern in residency, and my skill level is here, and I'm very, very nervous, and everything feels incredibly hard. How then do I get over into that flow channel?
Trying.
Yeah, you have to improve your skill set, right? And so this is actually going to create a drive for people to improve. It's exactly why training programs are structured the way they are, right? They throw you in, and you're going to be so anxious that in order to reduce that anxiety and to gain out of what you're doing, you're going to increase your skill set. And of course, if you keep going such that you're over in boredom land, what do? They promote you and make your job harder, right?
Can
Yes.
I introduce something from video games, which I know very little about, all from books? But video games are often structured so your skill level and your challenge match pretty precisely, and that you continually stay in that peak zone all the time. And if we could learn how to do that with the rest of our education, that would be amazing.
Habituation.
Yeah. When you find yourself getting bored, it's time to make things a little harder, and your skills will continue to grow, right? So that's flow. And what I gained from this when I was an intern in residency was part of what we had to do was overnight call in the emergency room. Overnight call in the emergency room means that if someone comes in a crisis and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, you hop up, you go downstairs, and you try to help them through this crisis and figure out what to do next, which is an hour and a half to a 2-hour process, depending on how complicated things are. And then you go back and sleep for about 10 minutes, hopefully before the next one comes through, right? So it's high challenge level, and you want to increase your skill set. So what I had to learn to do was to turn that into something that didn't induce so much anxiety for me, but it's something that I really loved, so that I actually looked forward to doing it instead of dreading it, right? And that's where the idea of strengths come in, character strengths, okay? So I'm going to start fresh. I told the rabbi that I'm trying to get away from PowerPoints, and so I'm going with the low-tech dry erase, because I actually enjoy drawing things and writing things while I'm talking, so.
Excuse me. Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
The skill axis, excuse me, part of that is natural, it's inborn. Part of it is the result of education. Is there any differentiation that breaks that down, or is it just individualized?
that's what I'd like to get into. No, it's good. That's a great segue. So it isn't enough to just say, stress people out and they'll get better at what they're doing,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't really work that way. And so this is where we really start to get into the idea of character strengths, okay? So character strengths, and the underlying research from this is from a psychologist. I use those terms back and forth a whole lot, and actually in popular culture there's an incredible amount of ambiguity, and we were watching a TV show the other day in which this guy is a third-year resident psychologist, which doesn't make any kind of sense, okay? So psychiatry comes from a medical school background, trains in a 4-year residency, prescribes medicines, gets some training in therapy, and depending on the interest of the individual psychiatrist, might do more or less of psychotherapy, but deals with things from a medical perspective. And then psychology training, we have a psychologist in the room with us, is from a PhD or a PsyD background, and that is focused more on the psychotherapy and on the research aspects of things, okay? So that's the difference between the two. So a psychologist named Martin Seligman, his initial work in his research for his graduate program and then subsequently was in a model called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness made him very depressed. So the gist was he wanted to find animal models of depression. And to do so, he basically put mice, rats, lab rats into situations such that they were going to be punished by their environment regardless of what they did. Okay? So nothing they did would fix it. It was just going to be punishing. When they reached a point that they stopped struggling against the punishment, he had created learned helplessness. Clearly, this was incredibly depressing, both for the mice and for him as a researcher. And so this research became very important for understanding how things like depression work, right? But it also inspired him to say, well, what if there's something like a learned strength, a learned optimism, or a learned resilience? Can the opposite also be trained? And so that's what leads to the line of research in the 90s and the 2000s that they start to call positive psychology, okay? Positive psychology makes it sound as if they're going to say things to you like, well, everything's fine, right? I don't know if anybody's read the novel Candide, but there's a character in there who's a very naive optimist. And it's like, everything's for the best in this best of all possible worlds. It's just saying positive things all the time. That's not what this is about, okay? This is about actually trying to understand what are character strengths, what are things that help people to have whatever the opposite of depression is, whether you want to call that optimism or hopefulness or resilience, okay? Stop me anytime you want to add something from Musar.
Well, I thought when you did this, I would do that.
Very good. So the sheet that I passed around actually has the 24 character strengths that were investigated by Seligman and Peterson. This is a research group out of University of Pennsylvania. They call themselves now the Values in Action, or the VIA Strengths Institute. They're trying to find ways to integrate these things into traditional psychotherapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy. The way they came to this list was by looking at pretty much anything they could find from any world culture that had talked through what character strengths are. Trying to find the ones that were most represented across the board, regardless of cultural background. But also, they had a few other criteria for them. They had to have qualities like, doing this does not bring other people down, right? So if you have a trait that you do more of it, and instead of just bringing you up, it brings everybody up, that was more likely to be a strength, all right? It also had to be things that were measurable in some way, because you can't do science on stuff that you can't measure. So they looked for things that there were validated psychological assessments, ways of measuring a person's, for example, honesty. Like honesty gets studied in the psychology lab. It's odd to think about that, but they do. The underlying theory of this approach to psychotherapy is that everybody has, in some degree or another, all of the strengths on this list. But people have different ones in more abundance than other people, and so those are called signature strengths, okay? So everybody you meet, anywhere you go, has these traits, but for that person, some of them will really stand out, and they're really well known for this trait or that trait. That's their character strength. And so I did their test, the strengths assessment, and what came up number one for me was called love of learning, all right? That's one of those strengths on this. And I was like, well, here's my solution. I'm nervous every night I'm on call and I gotta keep going to the ER. But what if I could say, well, my strength seems to be love of learning. It means I feel better when I get to learn stuff. I could turn each patient encounter into a learning opportunity and start to say to myself, what can I learn from this person? Whether that be learning about medicine, learning about how to interact with people, learning something, right? Doing that reframed for me what a call night was like, such that I wasn't actually nervous about it anymore. And when I got a call from downstairs, I thought, great, I get to learn something else. I'll go downstairs and do that, and that's fun. So in short, to answer your question, the way that you improve those skill sets is to identify what a person's signature strengths are and find ways to integrate those into the work that they're doing, right? So if a person is known for creativity, then they need to be able to use creativity in their work. Doing so, they will naturally incline toward increasing their skills because they have a better chance of enjoying it, of loving the work, of getting engaged in that flow experience. Does that make sense?
So that's a good segue to Musar, which you've all heard me talk about before. It comes from Proverbs. It means discipline, and it's probably a good 1,000-year-old process of figuring out what our characteristics, what our midot are, what each one we're particularly strong in, which ones we need to work on a little bit. For every one of these character strengths that Mr. Seligman, or Dr. Seligman, whatever his name is, that he came up with, there is a Musar character strength too. So, but what I find fascinating when I compare the Mindfulness and Character Strengths Guide to Flourishing, which is coming from the people Scott's been discussing, with Musar, is Musar in the 18th century developed a very specific process by which each individual could choose to work on a particular midah, a particular characteristic, and see where he or she wanted to go and go in that direction. So for instance, you mentioned honesty, right? In Hebrew we call that emet, truth. And each of us has a different relationship with the truth. And in different situations, we have different relationships with the truth. But so in Musar, you study what emet is, what truth is. You decide where you want to move on the truth spectrum. So for me, I tend to just not to say things. I lie by omission, right? If there's something uncomfortable, I just don't say it. It maybe should have been said and needed to be said. So by the time I notice that about myself, then I can choose a reminder every morning to remind myself about what I'm going to do that day. And as the day goes through, I just watch and see what my little mind does in relation to truth. And see and notice all the ways that I just kind of fudge it a little here and a little there. And then at nighttime, write it down in my journal, which might be, nothing happened today, it was a really boring day. I totally forgot about the truth thing. But if you keep doing this over the course of a couple of weeks, all of a sudden, you start to grab control of yourself and be able to mold yourself more in the direction that you want to be. And it doesn't have to be truth. It could be any number of things. It could be courage, it could be tzedek, it could be fairness, humility, anava. And so we'll talk more about these as we go on. But this idea that there is a process, a 200-year-old process that Jews have been working with in Musar, which very much models these characteristic strengths and this whole idea of positive psychology, and people have been working with it without the scientific aspect, with only just, we're doing this because this is what we're doing. It's just, these two meld really nicely together. So you keep going.
It is a scientific aspect, because you're experimenting with.
That is true. That is also
Yes, but
experimenting.
we're not really, we're not collecting the data. That's what we're not doing, right?
You do a journal, don't you?
My own personal data. I'm collecting my data, and I have lots of journals about me. But in terms of a sort of cultural-wide or worldwide understanding of this, people have not used the Musar experience that
Why
way.
we can't do science on ourselves, I mean.
You know, that's a good point. So, if in cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically, one thing that you try to do is to help the person who's receiving the therapy essentially become a scientist with regard to their own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And they engage in self-study. They're going to do homework. They're going to, like you said, they will write things down at night. They'll bring them back in. You'll talk about them. But they're learning to understand that they really have to examine themselves from a scientific point of view and then identify ways to make changes in their patterns and the patterns that are causing them problems currently. Is that close? Well, I'm engaging the psychologists in the room. Okay, so we also, in what the rabbi was talking about in terms of noticing these changes in yourself, because this is the Scientists in the Synagogue series, I'd like to incorporate a little bit about the brain, okay? And talk about what it means when we are shifting these things, what seems to be changing at the level of the brain, okay? So, in lieu of a PowerPoint, I'm going to draw a very terrible approximation of what a brain looks like. talk about some of the different bits. I want to talk about that bit. I want to talk about this bit. And there's stuff deep down inside up here. So just draw an arrow that we're going to talk about too. All right. So that's like it's like eyeballs, right?
Sock puppet.
It's a sock puppet.
Can you point to the section of the plan that Rabbi Woodward's knowledge of baseball was?
It's mostly here.
Oh, okay. That's the South Bronx.
Okay, so this is new research. This is in the past 15 years or so, which in the world of research is very, very new and recent, okay? One thing that the mental health knowledge base has struggled with for a century or more is trying to understand the connections between the mind and the brain, right? So pathologists are very much, the pathologists are the doctors that look at things like autopsies, they look at microscopic things on slides, and they try to understand the physical basis for disease, all right? And they've looked for and failed to find physical basis for things like anxiety problems and depression, and even things like hallucinations and psychosis. They just kept looking under the microscope. But we are now reaching a point of technology where we can start to see what the changes are, and they're far more subtle than something that can be seen under a microscope. It turns out that the brain is really about the most advanced computer that we could even imagine. It has billions of tiny connections that are kind of like the internet, and such that this is connected to this, is connected to this, and so forth. And you have different areas of the brain that if you scan the right way using fMRI, you can see when different parts of the brain are active, okay? And so this line of research means that if you are, say, going to play a game of chess, when we do an fMRI scan, we're going to see a lot of activity in the frontal cortex up here. This is the front. I'll put a nose down here so you know that that's say this is the neck. So it starts to look a little bit like a socket. So the frontal cortex is executive function, and that's where we do things like plan out our day and figure out what bills need to be paid, and make decisions about which path we're going to use to get from point A to point B, right? It's very much engaged when we're making choices. It's actually a lot of where conscious thought seems to be, all right? There are some deeper levels down here that are behind this stuff, close to this, that I've drawn this circle here for, that include regions like the amygdala, which just means almond in Latin. And that's just because that's what it looks like. It's just a little almond. And that's where things like anxiety live, okay? So that little amygdala, that almond on the inside, that lights up when people are scared or when they're angry, right? It's kind of the fight or flight response center, all right? Now, what we've begun to understand with these kinds of imaging techniques is that it's not just about one region lighting up versus another. It's which regions are connected to which other regions. So you can map out how strongly connected is this, which is where our intentional conscious thought lives. How strongly connected is it to the amygdala, so that you could, for example, talk yourself down from a panic attack, okay? It turns out that takes practice. Just like developing a physical skill, just like learning to play baseball, you can't just be told how to play baseball and then go out and do it, right? You've got to get the muscle memory, you've got to get the right physical state, you've got to work up to it, and that takes practice. Psychotherapy is ongoing practice that actually rewires these connections between different parts of the brain in a way that you can see. You can see it on imaging. It is real. So a person who has post-traumatic stress disorder, when they have something that triggers those horrific memories that put them into a state of panic and fear as if it's happening again right now. After they've gone through cognitive behavioral therapy for weeks and weeks and weeks, it takes weeks because you're practicing, you're changing the wiring. You can begin to see a pattern on the fMRI of frontal activation followed by a reduction in the amygdala activity. You're watching them use their conscious intent to bring down that anxiety level. And you can see this now on imaging, and that's pretty amazing. So that's to bring us into the neuroscience aspects of this, okay? One network that's very important is the one that lets us notice things. It's called a salience network. It involves the parietal lobe, among other things. Okay? There's another bit buried down here, and I've kind of vaguely put it up on this area, but it's more like down here. That's called the nucleus accumbens. That's where positive value gets assigned to things in the brain. The nucleus accumbens has incoming projections that release a neurotransmitter called dopamine. The dopamine makes you feel really good when it arrives in the nucleus accumbens, okay? So, in depression, the salience network, which notices things, is very weakly connected to the nucleus accumbens, which means we have a hard time getting any pleasure from what we can see out in the world, right? So with psychotherapy and a combination of medications and psychotherapy to actually produce more of what is called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the fuel by which the brain seems to rewire these connections, you can increase those connections between the salience network and the nucleus accumbens, and people can learn to see positivity in their environment again. They can notice when the sunshine is nice, when the strawberry tastes good, right? Things that they couldn't see before because of that disconnection. That gets us onto the topic of savoring and mindfulness. Did you want to add a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's all related to where I started, but so to be mindful of a particular characteristic, let's use hakarata tov, which is recognizing the good, right? Some of us are just all the time those optimistic kind of people that are just like, oh, look how beautiful the sun is today. Oh, it's raining today. Isn't it great? You know, that's can be really annoying, I know, because I'm one of those people and my husband tells me so. But other people may have, without being mentally ill, right? We're talking about mental illness, he's more talking about, and I'm talking more about just regular folk, can just have a negative approach to everything. Like, oh yeah, sun's out. Sure is hot and humid today. And oh, it's raining. Damn, I forgot my umbrella, whatever I wear in the rain. Right? You can always just have a negative approach to that. And if you notice that, you may not want to be the not-so-cuckoo, cockeyed optimist over here, right? That's not what you're aiming for. As we talked about, as you mentioned, Scott, that could be really bad, right? You don't just want to be that character in Candide where everything's for the best, it's all wonderful, because someone will probably punch you at some point, but also you're not being helpful to people in pain, right? So you don't necessarily want to be all the way on that end of the spectrum, but you might realize that you're making yourself and everyone around you a little bit less happy and able to deal with life if you're over here on this end of the spectrum. So first you figure out where you are, and the way to do that is to pay attention. That's where the mindfulness comes in. To have a practice, an easy way to do it is to put the screen on your phone, to put the reminder about this particular characteristic you're working on, recognizing the good, to put it on your phone screen so that every time you pick up your phone, if you're a person who carries a phone and looks at it all the time, obviously, the first thing you'll see is remember the good, recognize the good, and then you can make an intention for the day that I'm going to try to recognize the good in every situation that I come across. Not that every situation is going to be wonderful. There's going to be awful stuff happening. And it doesn't make everything good that happens, but to find a little piece of good in everything. Then you can decide what to do with it later, because obviously some things are traumatic. You don't want to go to the hospital when someone's dying and say you're going to a better place, right? That's not what we mean by recognizing the good. But I might not say it, but I might recognize the good that might be happening really soon in my mother-in-law's death, as she is way deep in dementia right now and seems to have no pleasure in anything at all, even her children. So maybe that's what I'll kind of be grabbing onto, right? So the mindfulness piece of it is trying to figure out and struggling with how that works with every single thing as you go through the day or the week or however long you set for that particular characteristic.
And it was funny, like you said, and this practice Musar, which has been around for hundreds of years, this has been known. And only in the last 10, 15 years do we even know what's happening in the brain that corresponds to this. But it is real. So the circuit that tends to run in your brain is when you're not doing something otherwise, you're just sitting there. It's called the default mode network. The default mode network seems to function like this. It looks through your memories, pulls something out, and it says, what about that? And then it tosses it, and then it looks through your memories and it pulls something out. You may call this daydreaming. You may call this rumination, right? Depending on the types of memories that you're plucking out and sifting through. The default mode network tends to run on its own, and if you're having problems with things like anxiety and depression, it is definitely digging up things that either worry you or make you feel bad. It's just what it's doing. It's running on autopilot, and it's doing that. What mindfulness is the best approach that we've discovered to grab hold of that default mode network and practice having intent about where it goes, okay? The reason I say practice is because you can't just be told how that works and then do it, just like with baseball. You actually have to keep trying at it, and the more you do, the better you get. So in this book, Everyday Holiness, which is on Musar, he talks about one of the rabbis who wrote that to really understand yourself, you need to have 30 minutes a day of being in seclusion and just being with yourself, right? You're not going to understand yourself until you basically have a meditation practice for at least 30 minutes a day. So you don't have to do that even. I would say you can practice mindfulness. It doesn't necessarily just mean sitting in meditation. Mindfulness is defined by a few features. You're being in the place you are. Your mind is in the room with you, right? You're not time traveling. We love to do negative mental time travel, right? This thing that's coming next week, oh my gosh. I'm so dreading that. And here I am, like I'm not even there yet, right? But say I've got this event where I've got to go do something stressful, I might just go live there in the future where I'm stressed, even now when I'm not, right? And I'm waking up that amygdala because it's, why wait till then to get nervous? We do negative mental time travel to the past as well. I cannot believe I said that. Oh my gosh. What are they thinking about me? I did this so wrong. I messed this up, right? That's negative mental time travel. Mindfulness means being where you're at. And it sounds almost like an empty thing to say, be where you are. You know, you see it on posters and stuff. In practice, it's a little hard to do. It actually takes messing it up and struggling with it over and over again to get better at it. The first second that you decide, all right, cool, I'm going to be where I'm at. I'm going to be mindful in this room. Your brain inevitably, and a second later, will be, yeah, but what about that thing tomorrow? Yep. There you are. Then you have to pull it back again, right? But pull it back gently, right? As we were reading in the Kedoshim this morning, It's a gentle rebuke. You don't say, brain, settle down, we need to be in the room. Because guess what? Then you're creating a new anxiety state. You just say, you know what? My goal has been to be where I'm at. So let me just do that again. Just start over. Just do it again, over and over again. That's mindfulness. Experiencing what you're experiencing, really taking it in. How many times, if we have a stressful job, do we, for example, eat a meal on the run? This is just about keeping my body going. I'm going to grab this thing and eat it while I'm literally walking from one office to another. That's not enjoyment, right? Savoring that moment and saying, you know what, actually, I think it'd be healthier for me if I took 5 minutes and had this food and actually saw it and tasted it and experienced it. That's savoring, right? But it takes that to be able to, and it takes practice to be able to do that. And you have to consciously choose to do it over and over again to get better at it, right? So that's what we mean by mindfulness. Mindfulness doesn't mean you have to sit still for 30 minutes every day and close your eyes and hum or chant or anything. Although you can do those things, and they're great. You can be mindful whatever you're doing. And it just requires being where you're at in that moment. And that is one of the things that also increases resilience. It turns out it's more important to practice that when things are fine so that you're good at it when things are not fine. In other words, we don't wait until we're in the midst of a panic attack to practice mindfulness. We practice when things are going well so that we've got the skills when the difficulty comes along. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Meditation you talked about, does that have any relation to the religious prayer? Jews supposed to pray 3 times a day, Muslims 5 times a day, Christians, I guess, every morning. Does that have any connection to what you're...
Personally, I think it very likely does. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but a lot of Jewish prayer is, they'll write about kavanah, the intention of really being with it and understanding the words as you're saying them. That requires you to be in the room. Having gone through the sequence of prayers, you may come out of it in a different mind state than you went in. And a lot of that could be that you had a mindfulness practice in engaging with that, right?
So there's 2 different things that come to mind about that. One is, most of us pray in Hebrew without knowing what it means, and it's a flow of sound and having a general idea. When we're singing Sholom Rav, it's about peace. Okay, I got that. But the syllables don't particularly mean anything to us. And that can have as profound an effect as knowing what every word means and paying attention to the words. Because even if the kavanah thing is so hard, right? How many times do you say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty. I can do that and think about something else. And I can do my prayers and think about something else. And so it's a mindfulness practice when you're praying to notice, hey, mind, what you doing now? Where are you? Are you here? Are you over there? Are you looking at that guy? You know, that's definitely a piece of it. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, to me, mindfulness is a really good, important state to cultivate. But as a creative person, I also need that switch off of my cognitive stuff and sort of delving into some other mind state, which maybe you could explain to me. So for instance, I tend to do my artwork from a very cognitive place. I use language, I think through it, and then I met this woman who was an art therapist who had us take a part from the Torah, and then she turned on music and gave us art supplies and just said, go. And that switched right past my whole cognitive self, and I got all this stuff I never knew was in there. So could you talk a little bit about what that mind state might be?
There's actually really good research on this in brain science, okay, neuroscience. So I'm going to create some of this, but leave up my sock puppet brain. Get my marker back. Restore the front part of the brain, which is important. Temporal lobe, which is important for memories and sounds, by the way. Our auditory cortex is here, where we get data from our ear, and then we process things we hear. So, if you take an fMRI scanner, which again lights up the parts of the brain that are in use, and you are getting master jazz musicians, and you get them to be in the scanner while they're doing one of two things. You have them do a task of, I want you to play this piece as it's written on the sheet in front of you. Play it precisely and exactly as you can. Then they will have a lot of activity up here, right? That's conscious thought. There's a lot of intention there. It's like playing chess. They're very good at it, but they've got all of that frontal stuff engaged because they're being very intentional and precise about it. And then you take the same musicians and you say, now, here's a chord progression. Improvise for me. Make something up, right? Which one do you think the musician likes doing more? Improvising. And that gets back to the flow state that we were talking about, okay? So that actually, you will, instead of seeing an increase, you see a decrease in this frontal conscious area. And a lot of the creativity is going to come from turning down your conscious thought about what you're doing and just becoming engaged with it, right? Remember, the idea about a flow state is that you don't perceive the passage of time. You lose yourself in what you're doing. It sounds like not being mindful, but it's actually intensely mindful because you're also not daydreaming and you're not time traveling. You're in the room, you're making the art, or you're playing the music, right? And it seems like it's all that exists for you in that moment. It's you and the music are really the same thing from all that you can tell. It's happening. Athletes do this in sports, right? When an athlete who is very, very good at what they do, when they can't tell from the game started, the game is over, they lost all that time. It's fine. I was just in it. I could not even tell how long the game lasted. Because for me, it was one moment, and I was caught up in what I was doing. That's a flow state. So it sounds like your art therapy teacher was creating conditions to encourage you guys to be in a flow state instead of having all of this frontal stuff turned up.
But it seemed to me like it brought out ideas that I didn't even know I had.
Yep.
Like, that was magic.
So, but to her point, what part of the brains are being turned up if the front's being turned down in that situation? Like when she's creating or the
That's
musician's
good.
creating?
So remember we talked about default mode network. Thank you, Tiana. We talked about memories because somebody asked me where Rabbi Witcher's knowledge of baseball went, and that's over here, right? So we have a thing called the hippocampus. What the hippocampus likes to do is to take information. Let's talk about how memory starts. So you perceive something with your eyes, okay? The part of the brain that receives that data by her eyeballs right here. So we have an optic nerve that goes all the way to the back to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe receives that data, the visual data from the eye. Your immediate working memory lives in that sensory space, okay? And every single moment you're taking in the most high definition, high resolution picture of the whole world around you. You're not storing all that permanently, are you? You would quickly run out of storage space, right? We can't constantly have a digital recorder keeping track perfectly of everything we're seeing. So that's your working memory. And then the hippocampus, which is down here. Hippocampus just means seahorse, because that's what it looks like. Seahorse down there. It's a terrible drawing. The seahorse then looks through those things and decides, is this relevant? Is this worth keeping? Do I need to store this in a longer term fashion? Part of how it does that is it has very rich interconnectivity with the almond, the amygdala. The amygdala assigns emotional value to memories, okay? And so if the hippocampus, in conjunction with the amygdala, has decided this memory is incredibly important, like I'm going to remember doing this, right? Because I get to talk to all of you people. This is not my typical Saturday morning. This is novel and exciting and awesome, and I'm in this beautiful room, right? All of that assigns such emotional weight to what I'm experiencing that I'm not just going to leave it in the occipital lobe for it to fade. It's going to get stored longer term. And when it gets stored longer term, it comes out here to the temporal lobe, and that's where it lives. So, to answer your question, after a long and circuitous route, being circumstantial today, when you have that frontal activity, that conscious activity turned down, what you're making room for is to wake up things that have been living over here in the temporal lobe that maybe you forgot were still stored in there, right? This is like if you've got a computer that you've had for 10, 15 years, and suddenly you look in a folder that you forgot even existed. There it is. There was this cool thing way back there that I forgot I even had, but here it comes out now because I've got all of this conscious stuff out of the way, and I can wake up all these things that are underneath. Yeah?
I want to comment on that, but with what I want to ask about prayer. When I've been to very traditional services, you see in there, they will in effect carve out a personal space that may take place standing, looking at the wall, or standing facing the wall, and there's no synchronicity as we experience here with prayers. And I thought that was a good example of pretty much what you're talking about. But this is not something I can do while being conscious of what's around me. I need to sort of, as like say,
Yeah, I think that's a part of what makes it a valuable practice, right? Gaining the ability to wrest control of that default mode network and say, you know what, we're not going to spend this morning being anxious about what's coming when work starts again on Monday. We're going to instead be right here. And even if I'm standing with a prayer book and I'm looking at a wall and I'm rocking and I'm really going through it, I'm not worried about Monday and work. I'm right here, right now. And the sounds and the images and everything come together. That is a flow state, and that is mindfulness, and it's really good for your brain. So I think that's exactly it. Yeah?
This has no relevance to myself, but as you age, what parts of, in a normal, healthy person, what parts of the brain deteriorate first?
Perfect, stays perfect.
Perfect.
Proof.
So,
If you think children have better memory, sixth grade
What
hope calls.
Pearson's brain fills with nothing.
Just in general, without illnesses and Alzheimer's, that type of
yes.
thing, but just normally, like your muscles deteriorate, certain your physical characteristics just automatically deteriorate.
Yes.
Certain first, second. I'm just wondering, in the mind, if there's some
Well,
sequence with general.
the answer to your question starts in infancy, okay? Interestingly. So, when you're first born, you have actually too many neurons, which is weird, right? Your connectedness in your brain is at its richest at the beginning of life. And in fact, you have too many, and it's a lot of noise, and it's a lot of weird connectivity that later is not going to be useful to you. And so if you're looking just at connections over the lifespan, let's say this is age, okay? Let's say this is being born, and say this is 20, 40, and so on. Okay? During this bit here, you've got such rich interconnections in the brain that actually it's less efficient. Imagine, Tom, if you were going to put a computer network together and somebody said, you know what, I don't want just a little bit of connectivity. I want everything literally connected to everything else. And I want really no guidance at all as to where the data needs to flow, right? So the immature brain has a lot of more connectivity. And that actually gradually decreases over time. And then it kind of plateaus. And then it very, very, very slowly decreases. So that connectivity is on a normal trajectory. Actually, the mature brain, which we receive somewhere between the ages of 22 and 25 for most human beings, that's when they've actually got enough differentiation between conscious thought and emotional reactivity to have decent judgment. You're a teenager until about 23, actually, as far as the brain's concerned. There are processes by which this goes too far, okay? So one way that schizophrenia has been understood in brain science is that this process continues too far and actually moves a lot faster. And so that was the initial onset of schizophrenia is usually around 21, 22 years old. And that's because this process, which was supposed to plateau, kept going. And you actually have less brain tissue overall. And so the answer to your question is very little, okay? Normal age-related brain atrophy is very mild, almost none, right? Joan was correct. As usual. But if you have a condition such as Alzheimer's, in Alzheimer's what's happening is there are abnormal proteins and they are accumulating and they're clumping up and they're actually so much of them clumping together that they start to kill off brain cells abnormally, then that actually takes its toll. The process of Alzheimer's starts much, much younger than when you see symptoms. And it just means that those cells can't tolerate all of that protein that's clumped together, and the cells start dying quicker than they would have. And so the overall brain tissue globally is much smaller than it would be at a person who did not have that condition. Does that make sense? Normal age-related atrophy is minimal. Minimal. That means it does exist a little bit, but only a little bit. So a normal type of memory change is word finding. Everybody develops word finding problems at some point.
The thing with the things.
The thing with the things. The thing with the basket full of things with which you write on the thing. Right? Who is the guy in that movie?
Yes.
That actor, tip of my tongue, right? That is a normal age-related memory change, and that's about the extent of it. Age-related atrophy.
And
The
usually,
little bit.
usually that quiet time when you're doing that,
That's when it pops back out, isn't it?
Yeah.
Exactly right. So you get the frontal lobe out of the way, the temporal lobe can wake back up, you get those data banks that have been hiding.
What's the mechanism or difference between just pure memory, where you can read information and recall, somebody gives you information so that you recognize it?
Gotcha. So, yes. So what we talk about is retrieval, okay? Memory retrieval is a conscious process. And that's when you want the frontal lobe. Imagine my drawing is still up here. Your frontal lobe says, I choose to go and find this file that's sitting on my hard drive, okay? Conscious process. That is a distractible process. In other words, if you're nervous, it's harder. If there's a lot of stuff going on and you're multitasking, it's harder. And you're like, I've got too much going on right now. I can't remember that thing, okay? And then like he said, when you got calm and quiet, suddenly it's like, oh, there it is. That popped right out, because now everything's fine. So that conscious process is about connectivity between the frontal and temporal lobes. And if our frontal lobe is otherwise engaged by, for example, being distracted by a million things going on, it's very difficult to go and retrieve those memories. You're basically making a specific request of the default mode network. I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but when you can slow down all that frontal activity and give it the space and the breathing room that it needs, it has a much easier time of retrieving those things. Yes?
Does early memory increase with age? I mean, I've heard that said sometimes. The older you get, the more you'll remember earlier parts of your life.
I do not know. I don't know.
Well, like patients with dementia often can't tell you what they had for breakfast, but they can tell you what their childhood was like.
That's exactly right, yeah. So that's about efficiency in storing memories. Remember what we talked about. When you say whatever you had for breakfast this morning, you saw it and you tasted it and maybe you smelled it, right? And all of those things lived in your sensory memory. In 6 months, if I said to you, on that one Saturday, what was it that you had for breakfast? No idea, no clue, right? So it lives in the sensory parts of the memory, but it's not necessarily important data unless you tried a new restaurant and it was terrible, in which case you remember that because you don't want to go back there anymore, right? So unless it's got something novel or weird or some reason for hanging on to it, you just let it go, right?
That sensory stuff, childhood tastes, having some foods that, oh, my aunt used to make something like this and I love it.
Yeah.
Or things like that. I happen to remember great dinners that you had, where and when and how much they cost.
That has a lot of emotional valence, right? And so that was your emotional center saying to the little seahorse, the hippocampus, this bit's really important. This is a good feeling and a good moment. Please hang on to this one. And so those they stick around, all right? So the first parts of the brain to atrophy in Alzheimer's dementia are the seahorses, the hippocampus. And that's the part, remember, that can pull things from the sensory centers out on the surface of the brain and decide that they're important enough to put into long-term storage. And it's going away, right? So as it atrophies, it can't do that job very efficiently. And so what I have for breakfast this morning is not going to get stored in the hard drive. It's not going to get put into the temporal lobe. But what's already in the temporal lobe is there. It's already there. And it's not necessarily going anywhere. And so exactly like you said, you still remember. Even if there is a dementia process going on, you can remember how tasty that meal was when you were 9 years old, you know, or what the sun was like on that cool day when you rode the bicycle down the hill. Like all of that stuff is already in the temporal lobe. And it's got all that emotional valency already linked with it. And so it's not going anywhere. We're not actually in the initial stages of dementia. We're not damaging those long-term storage areas. We're damaging the apparatus by which new ones get stored.
So in our last minute and a half, what would you like to give us to keep in our brains to take away from this particular morning?
To me, and then I'll answer David's question too, to me, the most important part of this is to understand that all of us have strengths, things that we're already known for and very good at. And we can get more quality of life when we can recognize those and use them. The more we can. If I'm a creative person and I never get an opportunity to be creative, I'm going to be miserable, right? I need to be able to bring creativity into the other work that I'm doing in order to make it fulfilling. If I love of learning, but I don't get to learn anything new, I'm miserable, right? So figuring out what are my strengths and how can I put them to use more often increases not happiness per se, but quality of life instead. That's, to me, the takeaway.